everyone, this is the course on principles of behavioral economics, and today we are going to begin discussions on strategic interactions. So, what are strategic interactions, what do they imply, and what are going to cover in strategic interactions that anyway you would get to know over a period of time, but broadly we can divide strategic interactions in three components. In the first, we are going to introduce the standard or analytical game theory, followed by the problems that are observed empirically with analytical game theory, and then what are the alternatives that are suggested by the behavioral economists, or rather we can say that we are going to also discuss behavioral games. So, first of all, trying to define strategic interactions. When people are engaged in a social interaction and are aware of the ways that their actions affect others and vice versa, we call this a strategic interaction. A strategy is defined as an action or a course of action that a person may take when that person is aware of the mutual dependence of the results for herself and for others. The outcomes depend not only on that person's actions, but also on the actions of others, and that is why we call it strategic interaction. Models of strategic interactions are described as games. Game theory is a branch of mathematics that studies strategic interactions, meaning situations in which each actor knows that the benefits they receive depend on the actions taken by all. So, the benefits, or the which we call payoff here in this case, are not solely dependent on what I do, but also depends on what others do. So, that is why we need to define strategies, and that is why game theory is a part of strategic interactions. A game is a model of strategic interaction that describes the players, the feasible strategies, the information that the players have, and their payoffs. Game theory is a way of understanding how people interact based on the constraints that limit their actions, their motives, and their beliefs about what others will do. Experiments and other evidence show that self-interest, a concern for others, and a preference for fairness are all important motives that explain how people interact. In most interactions, there is some conflict of interest between people, but also some opportunity for mutual gains. The pursuit of self-interest can sometimes lead to results that are considered good by all participants or outcomes that none of the participants would prefer. Self-interest can be harnessed for the general good in markets by governments limiting the actions that people are free to take, and by one's peers imposing punishments or actions that lead to bad outcomes. Though if you remember, in the very beginning we said that Adam Smith was a proponent of the invisible hand, which basically said that we are all driven by our self-interest, but then that leads to mutual gains for each other. But that might not be true in all circumstances, and as a result of which government interventions might be required that would limit the actions that people are free to take. For example, my self-interest could be on some day to play music very loudly, but then that may disturb my neighbors, and that could be inconvenient to many others. As we often see that during the wedding seasons, the procession actually blocks the roads that create traffic jam. So, these kind of actions are driven by self-interest. We are not really bothered about there are thousands of vehicles on the roads, and sometimes important roads are blocked by such activities. So, in those situations, we actually need interventions from some authorities to limit our actions so that our self-interest must not be detrimental to others. A concern for others and for fairness allows us to internalize the effects of our actions on others, and so can contribute to good social outcomes. If you are actually concerned about others, then if we start judging about what is fair and what is unfair, then probably we will not indulge in any activities despite of how important it is, that is going to cause certain inconvenience to others. As I was talking about wedding processions, so it is always possible to route the wedding processions through some other ways, so that main roads, national highways are also at times blocked. So, that should not happen. that may lead to major inconveniences. Suppose on that road takes to some important airports, and people need to arrive in airports or in train stations well within time. There is specified time. Unless and until you reach on time, you are going to miss your train or your flights. So, very sudden unexpected traffic jams, which generally do not clear off in another 30 minutes, 45 minutes, may cause extreme inconveniences to others. So, having a concern for others, having the understanding of what is fair or unfair, that will help us in internalizing the effects of our actions on others, and then accordingly we will not do anything that will be detrimental to others. Now, let us define the elements of a game. A description of social interaction which specifies the players, that is, who are interacting and with whom. Alternatively, these are the relevant decision making identities whose utilities are independent. They may be individuals, firms, teams, social organizations, political parties or governments. So, a game basically describes certain entities, one of them being the players. The second is strategies. These are different components or elements of game. Strategy, the term strategy refers to a complete plan of action for playing a game. So, what are the alternative actions that I have given my opponent's alternative actions? It is important to understand that in many games there may be many actions involved. A complete plan means that every possible contingency must be allowed for. Rule means a complete plan of action, and strategy means a specific action or move. The feasible strategies are basically the actions that are open or available to the players. Strategies often involve either cooperating or defecting. In the context of game theory, defection refers to a strategy where one player chooses an action that increases their own payoff at the expense of the other player. We will discuss about specific games where such concepts are extensively used. Cooperation involves making a risky move where the opponents may take advantage of you and reduce your payoff, or make a decision in favor of both, making both better off as a result. So, you may decide to cooperate. If the other player also decides to cooperate, then that is going to result in better payoffs for both of you. But suppose you decide to cooperate, but the other player does not decide to cooperate, then in that case there could be a substantial reduction in the payoff of yours, while the other player benefits from that. Then another component or element is the information, what each player knows while making their decisions. The payoffs is the third element, or the fourth element rather. They tell us what the outcomes will be for each of the possible combinations of actions. These represent changes in welfare or utility at the end of the game and are determined by the choice of strategy by each player. It is normally assumed that players are rational and have the objective of maximizing these utilities or expected utilities, which we are calling payoffs. Notice that the word each is important. What distinguishes game theory from decision theory is that in decision theory, outcomes only depend on the decision of a single decision maker, and that is why they are not part of strategic interaction, while game theory is part of strategic interaction because outcomes of one individual may depend on the decisions of the other individuals or other players involved in the game. Now, we just briefly talk about forms of game. The most commonly we come across the normal form representation of a game that specifies the strategies, payoffs and the players. Players are assumed to move simultaneously by default. So, the moves are simultaneously. So, these games are represented by tables or matrices. The normal form representation helps to clarify the key elements in the game. When the players do not move simultaneously and the sequence of moves is important, it is necessary to use an extensive form representation which usually involves a game tree. So, whenever the moves are sequential, so you can consider say the game of chess, the moves are sequential, that can also be considered as a game, and that is sort of an extensive form representation. We will be talking in details about extensive form representation with examples later. Now, we begin with an example of an analytical game. So far we are basically talking about analytical game or standard game or classical game theory, whatever you call it. That is basically the beginning of the game theory. So, as I was trying to tell you that strategic interactions are going to cover three things. The first is the analytical game or standard game or classical game theory, followed by its criticism, and then followed by behavioral game. Behavioral game and criticism, they probably go hand in hand. Nevertheless, we would be going in this sequence. So, first we are going to talk about analytical game or standard game theory. We will begin with an example to basically clarify the different elements that we have just introduced. So, the example goes as follows. One year there were two students taking chemistry. They both did so well on quizzes, midterms and labs that they decided to leave town and go partying the weekend before the exam. They mightily enjoyed themselves. However, on the last day they overslept and did not make it back to the campus in time for the exam. So, they called their professor to say that they had got a flat tire on the way to the exam, did not have a spare and had to wait for a long time. The professor thought about it for a moment and then said that he was glad to give them a make-up exam the next day. The two friends studied all night. At the assigned time, the professor placed them in separate rooms, handed them the exams and asked them to begin. The two friends looked at the first problem, which was a simple one about molarity and solutions and was worth 5 points, easy, they thought to themselves. Then they turned the page and saw the second question, which was of 95 points or marks, which tire? Now, this is a game where you understand that one friend's benefit, payoffs or marks are going to depend on the other friend's answer as well, because there are four possibilities. They are mentioned here. So, there are basically, all of us know that there are four tires of a vehicle, and that is why there are four possibilities, and each friend is going to mention one of those four possibilities, like which tire was flat. So, we generally measure player 1 across the rows and player 2 across the column. That is the standard practice. So, player 1 is one student, player 2 is the other student. What are the options each one of them have? The options are same: front left, front right, rear left and rear right. Now, you can see that if both of them right, front, left, then they clear the exam, they get A grade, because you have already an easy question like 5 marks and then 95 for this. You give the same answer, the professor is convinced. They are sitting in different rooms, they are sitting in separate rooms, so they cannot consult each other. In case they did not already decide or discussed it among themselves, then there are high possibility that they will not be coming up with the same answer. So, the long they come up with the same answer, like front right, front right, rear left and rear right, they are going to get A grades. But if they do not, or if their answers do not match, like one writes front right and the other one writes front left, player 1 writes right left, player 2 writes front left, rear left, and player 2 writes front left, player 1 writes rear right, player 2 writes front left. In all possible situations, their answers do not match and they are going to get 5 out of 100, which is as good as failing in the exam. So, you can see that whenever their strategies are not matching with each other in all those cells, I have put F, means they are going to fail. But generally this is how we do not write the payoffs. I will come to the payoffs next or later. So, this is a payoff matrix. What else? These are strategies. So, this is one strategy, RR, RL is another strategy, FR is one strategy, FL is another strategy. So, these individual moves are strategies, and then this is a strategy profile. A strategy profile like F and FL and FL. A strategy profile could be FL and FR. So, a strategy profile basically consists of strategies of each of the two players. So, here there are only two players. So, when whatever strategies we pick each of each player, combine them together. So, it is a vector of each strategy from all the players involved, here in this case 2 players, we call it a strategy profile. So, FL, FR, FLRL, FLRR, all these are strategy profiles. Now, analytical game theory has something called Nash equilibrium, and we are talking about Nash equilibrium in pure strategy. So, what is pure strategy, that we may tell you a little later. For the time being, analytical game theory is built around the concept of an equilibrium. The most prominent equilibrium concept is that of Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is defined as a strategy profile such that each strategy in the profile is a best response to the other strategies in the profile. To say that you are playing a best response means that you can do no better by switching to another course of action given what the other players are up to. In other words, it means that there is no alternative strategy available to you that would give you a strictly higher payoff, again given what the other people do. So, here I am giving you the same problem with payoffs. So, if both of them give the same answer, then they are getting 100 out of 100. So, see, for all the cells where we have FR, FR, then RL, RL and RR, RR, they are getting full marks. So, these are their payoffs, and whenever their answers are not matching, then they are getting only 5 marks. So, these are their payoffs. And what is the Nash equilibrium here in this case? How do we determine the Nash equilibrium? So, we consider individual players, individual strategy, and check that given this strategy what the other player is going to do. For example, if player 1 writes FL, what is best for player 2 to write? Of course, this is FL. Another thing I need to mention here is that in each cell, as you can see that I have 2 numbers. The first number always represent player 1's payoff, and the second number always represent player 2's payoff. So, in each cell the first number is player 1's payoff and the second number is player 2's payoff. So, if player 1 writes FL, player 2 is better off, or the best strategy is to write FL. Player 1 writes FR, again the best strategy for player 2 to write FR. Player 1 writes RL, best strategy for player 2 to write RL. Player 1 writes RR, best strategy for player 2 is to write RR. Now, I look at player 2. If player 2 writes FL, then it is best for player 1 to write FL. Player 2 write FR, best for player 1 to write FR. Player 2 writes RL, again best for player 1 to write RL, because I am comparing all these numbers, this is the highest. So, this is what is best to write, and then again when player 2 writes RR, by comparing all these numbers I find that this is the highest. In this game there are 4 Nash equilibrium, namely FL, FL, FR, FR, RL, RL and RR, RR. The long they give the same answers, they are going to be equally better off, and these are the best responses for them. So, in a Nash equilibrium, therefore, everyone does as well as they can given what the others are doing. This is different from saying that the outcome will be as good as it can get. As we will see, being in a Nash equilibrium does not mean that the outcome is particularly good for anyone. This example illustrates the interactive or strategic nature of many decision problems. Here, the final grade of either friend will depend not just on his answer to the question, but on the other friend's answer too. The two will get A's whenever they give the same answer to the question and F's whenever they do not. More formally speaking, you are playing a game whenever you face a decision problem in which the final outcome depends not just on your action and on whatever state of the world obtains, but also on the actions of at least one other agent. According to this definition, the two friends are in fact playing a game against each other, and this is true whether or not they think of it as a game. Notice that you can play a game in this sense without competing against each other. Nash equilibria in which each player simply plays one of the individual strategies available to him or her. In all, there are 4 Nash equilibria in pure strategies, as I have already shown you, one for each tier in the previous example. Let us look at another example involving Nash equilibrium in pure strategy. So, we call it a pure coordination game. A pure coordination game is defined as the one in which the players' interests are perfectly aligned. Suppose you and your friend are planning to meet at noon at one of the 2 coffee shops, CCD and Starbucks. Unfortunately, you failed to specify which one and you have no way of getting in touch with each other before noon. If you manage to meet, you get a utility of 1. In the sense, if both of you end up arriving at the same shop, you get a utility of 1, otherwise you get a utility of 0. So, the long you are in different shops, you are getting a utility of 0, and that is true for both of you. Now, draw the payoff matrix and find the Nash equilibrium pure strategy. So, it is a pretty simple game. Everyone has only 2 strategies, going to CCD or going to Starbucks. If both of them go to CCD, then they get 1 1. If both of them go to Starbucks, they get 1 1. If one go to CCD and 2 go to Starbucks, then it is 0 0, and similarly if one goes to Starbucks and 2 goes to CCD, it is 0 0. So, what is the Nash equilibrium here in this case? Again we will see that when player 1 goes to CCD, I will check the second numbers for player 2. So, player 2 is definitely better off by going to CCD. When player 1 goes to Starbucks, player 2 is better off by going to Starbucks. When player 2 goes to CCD, I check these 2 numbers and player 1 is better off by going to CCD. When player 2 goes to Starbucks, then player 1 is again better off by going to Starbucks. So, there are 2 Nash equilibria, one is CCD CCD and another one is Starbucks Starbucks. So, these are the 2 Nash equilibria that we have here. The convention is for the first number in each cell to represent the payoff of player 1 whose strategies are listed in the leftmost column. The second number in each cell represents the payoff of player 2 whose strategies are listed in the top row. So, this is what I have already mentioned. The Nash equilibria in pure strategies here are CCD CCD and Starbucks Starbucks. The coffee shop game is an example of a pure coordination game. In some coordination games, however, interests fail to align perfectly. So, some such game is called impure coordination game, and very important kind of game is the battle of sexes. So, let us describe the game battle of sexes, but I must tell you that battle of sexes does not always refer to this game. Now, it has emerged as a type of game where whenever there will be impure coordination, we can call it a game of battle of sexes. A husband and wife must decide whether to go for a concert or a theatre. All things equal, both would rather go for a concert together than alone, but the man, who we assume here to be player 2, prefers the theatre and the woman, that is player 1, prefers the concert. The man gets 2 units of utility if both go to theatre, 1 if both go to the concert. Because he does not like concert much, that is why he gets higher utility from theatre, but he gets 0 if they go to separate places. So, it is not that going to theatre alone is something which is preferred. So, the first preference is that they want to stick together, but then more enjoyment from theatre for the man. So, that is why gets an utility of 2, while somewhat lesser. So, that is why utility of 1 from concert, but if they go to separate places, then it is 0. The woman alternatively gets 2 units of utility if both go to the concert, 1 if both go to the theatre and 0 if they stay apart. Now, draw the payoff matrix and find the Nash equilibrium in pure strategies. So, this is simply again the Nash equilibrium, a 2 by 2 matrix of game we can see. We are measuring player 1, the wife here, and player 2 is the husband. So, when player 1 is going to concert, she is getting 2, husband is getting 1. When both of them are going to theatre, she is getting 1 and the man is getting 2. If they are going to separate places, then their payoffs are 0 0. Here the 2 NEs are concert concert and theatre theatre, because as you can see that if the wife goes to concert, then by comparing these two numbers, we find that the husband is going to concert. If the wife is going to theatre, then again the husband finds that he is better off by going to theatre. If the husband is going to concert, then the wife, if we compare 2 and 0, is better off by going to concert, and if the husband is going to theatre, then the wife is better off by going to theatre. So, as a result of which concert, concert and theatre, theatre are the two Nash equilibrium. Because player 1 prefers one equilibrium and player 2 prefers the other, the battle of sexes is an example of an impure coordination game. Theatre, theatre is player 2's best outcome. He cannot improve his payoff by changing strategies. Although player 1 would prefer it if both switched to concert, she cannot improve her payoff by unilaterally debuting also. If she plays concert when player 2 plays theatre, she will end up with a payoff of 0 rather than 1. Because player 1 prefers the one equilibrium and player 2 prefers the other, the battle of sexes, sometimes euphemistically called Badge of Stravinsky. As these games illustrate, there is no straightforward connection between Nash equilibria and best outcomes for the players. As a result, it would be a mistake to try to identify the former, that is the Nash equilibria, by searching for the latter, the best outcome. So, it is not necessary that Nash equilibria ensures the best possible outcome for every player or each player. Now, let us talk about some examples of games and derivations of Venice. We will also establish certain facts through this. So, this is one simple game again of 2 by 2 matrices, and what we observe is that suppose player 1 chooses U, then player 2 is better off by playing L because 2 is greater than 0. If player 1 decides to play D, then player 2 is better off by playing right or R. Now, if player 2 decides to play L, then again by comparing 2 and 0, player 2 is better off by playing U. If the player 2 decides to play R, then player 1 is better off by playing D or down. So, these two are the two Nash equilibria. One is, now you can see, clearly inferior to the other. So, this is 2 2, this is 1 1, both are Nash equilibria. But if both of them end up playing 1 1, then there are always opportunities to make themselves better off. So, Nash equilibria does not always imply that these are the best outcome. Here the two outcomes are there. One is definitely offering the best possible outcome, but the other is not, while both of them are Nash equilibria. Now, let us consider another example where if player 1 goes for U, then player 2 would be better off by playing L. Player 1 plays D, player 2 is better off by playing R. When player 1 2 plays left, then player 1 would be indifferent between up and down, and when player 2 plays right, then player 1 is actually better off by playing up. So, comparing 1 and 2, player 1 would be playing 2. So, here in this case you can see that UL, because player 1 was indifferent between 5 and 5, she can play both. So, 5 1 UL is the only Nash equilibrium, though DL is also as good as UL, but it is not a Nash equilibrium, because we cannot ensure that if player 1 chooses D, then player 2 will choose L. Of course, when player 1 chooses D, player 2 chooses R, and when player 2 chooses R, then player 1 chooses U. So, as a result of which DL is not a Nash equilibrium, even though the payoffs associated with UL and DL are the same. This is another example where it is a 3 by 3 payoff matrix. Here again let us look at the payoffs and what is the Nash equilibrium. Now, for up, the player 2 will choose R, for middle player 2 will choose L, for down player 2 will choose L again. Now, when player 2 chooses L, then player 1 chooses up. When player 2 chooses middle, player 1 chooses down or D, and when player 2 chooses R or right, then player 1 chooses up. So, as you can see that only here both the numbers are encircled. So, this is the only Nash equilibrium here. So, UR is the Nash equilibrium, though there are outcomes that are better for both players. For example, MM is an outcome which is better for both players. DM is another outcome which again is better for both players. Still, any is the Nash equilibrium and these are not Nash equilibria. These examples show that there is no straightforward connection between Nash equilibria and the best outcomes for the players. So, with this I conclude this module on the introduction of analytical game theory. We have just introduced the concept of Nash equilibrium. In the next we are going to continue with further discussions on analytical game theory. Thank you.